Hey everyone, I'm the storyteller, and I'm here to help you relax tonight. I know a lot of you use this video to fall asleep, so before we start, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, tell me in the comments, where are you from, and what time is it there? Now get comfortable, take a deep breath, and just relax. The night delivery. Growing up in a quiet suburban neighborhood, I thought I understood what safety meant. Our street was lined with modest homes, each with their own small gardens and white picket fences. Children played on the sidewalks during summer evenings, and neighbors waved to each other from their porches. It was the kind of place where nothing terrible ever seemed to happen, where the most exciting event might be Mrs. Henderson's cat getting stuck in a tree or Mr. Patterson accidentally mowing over his wife's flower bed. My family lived in a small two-story house with blue shutters and a front porch that my mother decorated with hanging baskets of petunias every spring. We had lived there for as long as I could remember, watching the seasons change and the neighborhood slowly evolve. Some families moved away, others moved in, but the rhythm of our little community remained largely the same. Directly across the street from us stood a house that had always captured my attention. It was larger than most of the other homes on our block, with a perfectly manicured lawn and flower beds that looked like they belonged in a magazine. The house was painted a pristine white, and every shutter was perfectly aligned. Even the mailbox was positioned at the exact angle that seemed most aesthetically pleasing. Everything about the property screamed perfection, from the ornate front door with its polished brass knocker to the stone pathway that led from the sidewalk to the porch without a single weed growing between the cracks. The house belonged to Mr. and Mrs. Richardson, a couple in their mid-30s who had moved into the neighborhood about 3 years before the events I'm about to tell you unfolded. Mr. Richardson was a tall, thin man with dark hair that was always perfectly styled. He wore expensive suits even on weekends and drove a sleek black sedan that he treated like it was made of precious metal. Every Saturday morning, without fail, he would emerge from his garage wearing khaki pants and a pressed polo shirt, carrying a bucket of supplies and several microfiber cloths. What followed was a ritual that fascinated and puzzled me in equal measure. Mr. Richardson would spend the entire morning washing, waxing, and polishing his car with the dedication of someone preparing for a car show. He would start with the wheels, scrubbing each rim until it gleamed, then move on to the body of the vehicle, working in small sections to ensure every square inch received the same meticulous attention. He would vacuum the interior, wipe down the dashboard, and even clean the inside of the windows with a precision that bordered on obsessive. The strangest part was that he barely drove the car. During the week, it sat in his driveway like a showpiece, never accumulating dust or dirt because he covered it with a custom-fitted car cover every evening. On the rare occasions when he did drive it, he would return within an hour and immediately inspect every surface for any signs of contamination. I often watched him from my bedroom window, wondering what could possibly drive someone to care so deeply about an automobile. Mrs. Richardson was everything her husband was not. Where he was cold and distant, she radiated warmth and kindness. She had shoulder-length blonde hair that she often wore in a simple ponytail, and she dressed in comfortable clothes that suggested she cared more about practicality than fashion. She worked part-time at the local library, and I would often see her walking to and from work, always carrying a canvas bag filled with books. Unlike her husband, she was social and friendly, often stopping to chat with neighbors about their gardens, their children, or the weather. Whenever she saw me playing in our front yard or walking home from school, she would wave and ask how I was doing. Sometimes she would even cross the street to talk to my mother, and they would stand by our mailbox discussing recipes or sharing stories about their days. Mrs. Richardson had a laugh that was infectious, the kind that made you smile even if you didn't know what she was laughing about. She seemed genuinely interested in the lives of everyone around her, and her presence made our neighborhood feel more connected and friendly. About 2 years after the Richardsons moved in, they welcomed a daughter into their family. Little Emma was an absolute delight. with curly blonde hair like her mother's and bright blue eyes that sparkled with curiosity and mischief. She was the kind of child who brought joy wherever she went, always giggling and babbling happily as her mother pushed her in a stroller around the neighborhood. Mrs. Richardson would often bring Emma to the small park at the end of our street, where they would spend hours on the swings and slides, Emma's delighted squeals echoing across the playground. I remember thinking how perfect their family seemed. Mrs. Richardson would sit on a park bench reading while Emma played in the sandbox, occasionally looking up to make sure her daughter was safe and happy. When Emma would toddle over with a handful of sand or a leaf she had discovered, Mrs. Richardson would examine her treasure with the same serious attention she might give to a precious gemstone, praising Emma's discovery and encouraging her natural curiosity about the world around her. The contrast between the parents was striking, but seemed to work well for their family dynamic. Mr. Richardson provided stability and security, while Mrs. Richardson brought warmth and emotional connection. Emma seemed to thrive in this environment, growing from a quiet baby into a cheerful, confident toddler who wasn't afraid to explore her surroundings or interact with new people. During the summer evenings, I would often see the three of them in their backyard. Mrs. Richardson would be tending to her flower garden, while Emma played with her toys on a blanket spread across the grass. Mr. Richardson would usually be cleaning his car in the driveway, but occasionally he would join his family in the backyard, and I could see him smile and laugh in a way that suggested he was a different person when he was with his wife and daughter. Those moments made me think that despite his obsessive tendencies and antisocial behavior, he truly loved his family and found peace in their company. The neighborhood routine continued peacefully for months. Every morning, Mrs. Richardson would load Emma into her white SUV and drive her to daycare before heading to work at the library. In the afternoons, she would return with Emma, and they would spend time in their yard or take walks around the neighborhood. Mr. Richardson would come home from his job at an investment firm, disappearing into the house without acknowledging any of the neighbors. On weekends, the family would sometimes drive away together, returning hours later with shopping bags or takeout containers, suggesting they had spent the day running errands or enjoying family time away from home. Then, on a Tuesday morning in late September, everything changed. I was getting ready for school when I noticed that Mrs. Richardson's SUV wasn't in the driveway. This wasn't necessarily unusual, as she sometimes left early for work or had errands to run before dropping Emma off at daycare. But as the day progressed and I returned home from school that afternoon, the SUV still wasn't there. The house looked dark and empty, with no signs of the usual activity that accompanied Mrs. Richardson and Emma's daily routines. That evening, while my family was eating dinner, we saw police cars pulling into the Richardsons' driveway. Two officers got out and walked to the front door, where they were met by Mr. Richardson. Even from our dining room window, we could see that something was seriously wrong. Mr. Richardson was gesticulating wildly, his usually composed demeanor completely shattered. The officers were taking notes and asking questions, their body language suggesting they were dealing with a serious situation. After the police left, my father crossed the street to check on Mr. Richardson and see if there was anything our family could do to help. When he returned 20 minutes later, his face was grave and concerned. He explained that Mrs. Richardson and Emma had disappeared. According to Mr. Richardson, his wife had been acting strangely for several weeks, seeming distant and secretive. He claimed that when he came home from work that afternoon, he found a note saying that she was leaving him and taking Emma with her. The news sent shockwaves through our quiet neighborhood. Mrs. Richardson had never seemed unhappy or given any indication that she was planning to leave her husband. She had always appeared to be a devoted mother who loved spending time with Emma, and she had never mentioned any marital problems to any of the neighbors she regularly chatted with. The idea that she would suddenly abandon her life and disappear without telling anyone seemed completely out of character. Over the next several days, more police officers came and went from the Richardson house. Detectives interviewed neighbors, asking if anyone had seen or heard anything unusual in the days leading up to the disappearance. They wanted to know if Mrs. Richardson had seemed upset, or if there had been any arguments or disturbances coming from the house. Most of us had nothing helpful to offer. The Richardson family had always been quiet, and if there had been problems in their marriage, they had kept them well hidden from the outside world. As the weeks turned into months, the mystery only deepened. There was no activity on Mrs. Richardson's credit cards, no withdrawals from their bank accounts, and no contact with any of her friends or family members. Her cell phone had been turned off, and there were no social media posts or digital breadcrumbs that might indicate where she and Emma had gone. It was as if they had simply vanished into thin air, leaving no trace of their whereabouts or intentions. The police investigation continued, but without any concrete evidence of foul play, their options were limited. Missing persons cases involving adults who may have left voluntarily are notoriously difficult to solve, especially when there are no witnesses and no clear motive for the disappearance. The detectives interviewed Mr. Richardson multiple times, searching the house and property for any clues that might shed light on what had happened to his wife and daughter. During this period, Mr. Richardson's behavior became increasingly erratic and disturbing. The man who had once been obsessively neat and organized began to let his appearance and property deteriorate. His once perfect lawn grew long and unkempt, weeds sprouting between the stones of his pristine walkway. The flower beds that Mrs. Richardson had carefully maintained became overgrown with dandelions and crabgrass. Most significantly, his beloved car began to accumulate dust and dirt, the weekly cleaning ritual abandoned as his world fell apart around him. I often watched him from my bedroom window, and what I saw was troubling. He would pace back and forth in his driveway at odd hours, sometimes in the middle of the night, muttering to himself and occasionally shouting at no one in particular. During the day, he would sit on his front porch for hours, staring blankly at the street as if waiting for someone who would never return. His eyes had developed a wild, haunted look, and he had lost a significant amount of weight, his clothes hanging loosely on his diminishing frame. The neighbors began to whisper among themselves, sharing theories and suspicions about what might have really happened to Mrs. Richardson and Emma. Some people believed Mr. Richardson's story and thought that Mrs. Richardson had indeed left him for another man, perhaps someone she had met at the library where she worked. Others were more skeptical, pointing out that she would never have abandoned her friends and family without any explanation or contact. A few neighbors expressed darker suspicions, wondering if Mr. Richardson had done something terrible to his wife and daughter, and was now trying to cover it up by claiming they had left voluntarily. These whispered conversations took place over backyard fences and during chance encounters at the grocery store, but no one wanted to voice their suspicions too loudly, and certainly no one wanted to make accusations without evidence. The atmosphere in our neighborhood changed dramatically during this time. What had once been a safe, friendly community where children played outside until dark and neighbors left their doors unlocked became a place filled with suspicion and fear. Parents began keeping their children inside after school, and people started locking their doors and windows even during the day. The disappearance of Mrs. Richardson and Emma had shattered our collective sense of security, reminding all of us that terrible things could happen anywhere, even in the most seemingly peaceful and ordinary places. About 6 months after the disappearance, I witnessed something that still haunts me to this day. It was a Saturday afternoon in early spring, and I was in my room doing homework when I heard the sound of Mr. Richardson's garage door opening. This was unusual because he rarely used his car anymore, and when he did venture out, it was usually on foot to walk to the small grocery store a few blocks away. I looked out my window and saw him backing his sedan out of the garage. But what caught my attention was what I glimpsed inside the garage as he pulled out. In the back corner, partially hidden behind some old furniture and boxes, was Mrs. Richardson's white SUV. The vehicle was covered with a thick layer of dust and looked like it hadn't been moved in months. This discovery sent chills down my spine because it raised a terrible question. If Mrs. Richardson had left voluntarily with Emma, why was her car still in the garage? I immediately told my parents what I had seen, and after much discussion, my father decided to call the police. When the detectives arrived, they obtained a search warrant and thoroughly examined the SUV. What they found inside was even more disturbing than the mere presence of the vehicle. Emma's car seat was still installed in the back, and there were toys and snacks scattered throughout the interior, suggesting that the car had been abandoned suddenly, without any time for Mrs. Richardson to collect her daughter's belongings. More troubling were the traces of what appeared to be blood on the driver's seat and steering wheel. The stains were small and might have been overlooked by a casual observer, but forensic testing would later confirm that the blood belonged to Mrs. Richardson. This evidence transformed the case from a missing persons investigation into a potential homicide, and Mr. Richardson became the primary suspect in his wife and daughter's disappearance. The police arrested Mr. Richardson the following day, charging him with 2 counts of murder despite the fact that no bodies had been found. The case against him was largely circumstantial, built on the presence of Mrs. Richardson's SUV in his garage, the blood evidence in the vehicle, and inconsistencies in his story about when and how his wife and daughter had disappeared. During the trial that followed, a disturbing picture of Mr. Richardson emerged. Co-workers testified that he had been increasingly agitated and paranoid in the weeks leading up to the disappearance, convinced that his wife was having an affair and planning to leave him. He had become obsessed with tracking her movements, installing surveillance equipment in their home, and following her on her daily errands. Several witnesses described incidents where he had confronted Mrs. Richardson in public, accusing her of infidelity and threatening to take Emma away from her if she tried to leave him. The prosecution argued that Mr. Richardson had killed his wife and daughter in a fit of rage and jealousy, then disposed of their bodies and staged the scene to make it appear as if they had left voluntarily. They pointed to his obsessive personality, his history of controlling behavior, and his increasingly erratic mental state as evidence of his capacity for violence. The defense maintained that the evidence was purely circumstantial, and that there were other possible explanations for the blood in the SUV, and the inconsistencies in Mr. Richardson's statements. They argued that he was a grieving husband and father whose strange behavior was the result of trauma and desperation, not guilt. Without bodies or witnesses to the alleged crimes, they claimed the prosecution could not prove beyond a reasonable doubt that murders had even occurred. The trial lasted for 6 weeks and received extensive coverage in the local media. Our quiet neighborhood was overrun with reporters and camera crews, turning our street into a circus of sensationalism and speculation. Neighbors were interviewed and asked to share their memories of the Richardson family, their observations about Mr. Richardson's behavior, and their theories about what might have happened to Mrs. Richardson and Emma. Throughout the trial, I found myself thinking constantly about the family I had observed from my bedroom window. I remembered Mrs. Richardson's kind smile and infectious laugh, the way she would cross the street to chat with my mother about ordinary things like recipes and gardening tips. I thought about little Emma, with her curly hair and bright blue eyes, playing in the sandbox at the neighborhood park while her mother watched from a nearby bench. The contrast between those happy memories and the horrific accusations being discussed in the courtroom was almost impossible to reconcile. How could the man who had seemed genuinely happy when playing with his daughter in the backyard be capable of murdering his own family? How could the woman who had been so full of life and love simply vanish without a trace? In the end, the jury found Mr. Richardson guilty on both counts of murder in the first degree. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole, noting that while the case was built on circumstantial evidence, the totality of that evidence painted a clear picture of premeditated murder followed by an elaborate cover-up attempt. Mr. Richardson maintained his innocence throughout the trial and continued to claim that his wife had left him voluntarily, taking Emma with her to start a new life somewhere far away. He insisted that he had no idea how her blood had gotten into the SUV or why the vehicle had been left in his garage. His explanations became increasingly bizarre and contradictory as the trial progressed, suggesting either that he was lying or that his mental state had deteriorated significantly under the stress of the investigation and legal proceedings. After the trial ended and Mr. Richardson was taken away to begin his life sentence, Our neighborhood slowly began to return to some semblance of normalcy. The reporters and camera crews disappeared. The Richardson house was eventually sold to a new family, and people began to venture outside again without the constant fear that had gripped our community for over a year. But the scars from this experience have never fully healed. Every time I drive past the house where the Richardson family once lived, I think about Mrs. Richardson and Emma, and I wonder what really happened to them during those final moments of their lives. Were they afraid? Did they suffer? Are their remains buried somewhere, waiting to be discovered by hikers or construction workers, or were they disposed of in a way that ensures they will never be found? The case remains officially solved in the eyes of the law, but for those of us who lived through this nightmare, there are still so many unanswered questions. Without bodies or a confession from Mr. Richardson, we may never know the complete truth about what happened to Mrs. Richardson and Emma. We may never understand what drove a seemingly ordinary man to commit such an unthinkable act against his own family. The experience taught me that evil can hide behind the most mundane facades, that the person washing his car every Saturday morning with obsessive precision might be capable of unspeakable horrors. It shattered my childhood belief that bad things only happened in other places to other people, forcing me to confront the reality that darkness can lurk anywhere, even in the most peaceful and ordinary neighborhoods. Years have passed since Mr. Richardson was sent to prison, and I have moved away from that neighborhood to pursue my education and career in another city. But late at night, when I'm lying in bed trying to fall asleep, I sometimes think about Mrs. Richardson and Emma. I imagine them living safely somewhere under assumed names, free from the man who terrorized them and forced them to abandon their old lives. It's a comforting fantasy, but I know in my heart that it's not true. The evidence presented at trial painted a clear picture of what most likely happened, and the blood found in Mrs. Richardson's SUV tells a story that no amount of wishful thinking can change. Two innocent people lost their lives because of one man's inability to control his jealousy and possessiveness, and their absence has left a permanent hole in the fabric of our community. The house where they once lived now belongs to a young couple with two small children of their own. Sometimes when I visit my parents, I see the new family playing in the backyard where Mrs. Richardson once tended her flower garden, and I watch their children running around the same yard where Emma once played with her toys on a blanket spread across the grass. These scenes fill me with a mixture of hope and sadness. Hope that this new family will create happy memories in a place that was once touched by tragedy, and sadness that Mrs. Richardson and Emma will never have the chance to create any new memories of their own. They exist now only in the recollections of those who knew them, in the photographs that decorated their home, and in the hearts of neighbors who still miss their presence in our community. The story of the Richardson family serves as a sobering reminder that we never truly know what goes on behind closed doors, even in the homes of people we see every day. It's a reminder that appearances can be deceiving, that obsessive behavior can escalate into violence, and that the people we love most can sometimes be the ones who pose the greatest danger to our safety and well-being. Most importantly, it's a reminder to pay attention to the warning signs of domestic abuse and controlling behavior, and to speak up when we suspect that someone might be in danger. If Mrs. Richardson had felt comfortable confiding in her neighbors about her husband's increasingly erratic and possessive behavior, perhaps the outcome might have been different. Perhaps she and Emma might still be alive today, playing in that backyard and filling our neighborhood with their laughter and joy. But we will never know what might have been, and that uncertainty is perhaps the most haunting aspect of this entire tragedy. All we can do is remember Mrs. Richardson and Emma with love, honor their memory by creating safer communities where domestic violence is recognized and addressed, and hope that their story serves as a warning that helps protect other families from similar fates. The night I last saw them, Mrs. Richardson was pushing Emma on the swing at the neighborhood park, both of them laughing as the swing carried Emma higher and higher into the warm summer air. It's the image I choose to hold on to when I think about them now. Not the blood evidence, or the courtroom testimony, or the empty house with its overgrown garden, but that moment of pure joy and love between a mother and her child. That image reminds me that despite all the darkness and horror that followed, there was once light and happiness in their lives. They were loved, they were cherished, and they brought joy to everyone who knew them. No amount of violence or evil can take away those precious memories or diminish the positive impact they had on our community during their time with us. Mrs. Richardson and Emma may be gone, but they are not forgotten, and their memory continues to inspire those of us who were fortunate enough to know them to live with greater kindness, awareness, and appreciation for the precious gift of each ordinary day spent with the people we love. The night shift nurse. Working as a nurse at Riverside General Hospital had always been my calling, but the night shift in the psychiatric ward tested every limit of my courage and compassion. The old wing of the hospital, built in the 1940s, creaked and groaned through the dark hours, its long corridors stretching like arteries through a sleeping giant. The fluorescent lights flickered intermittently, casting dancing shadows that made even familiar spaces feel foreign and threatening. Our ward housed 24 patients, ranging from those dealing with severe depression to individuals experiencing complete breaks from reality. Most nights were routine: medication rounds, chart updates, and the occasional crisis that required immediate intervention. But there was one patient who made every shift feel like walking through a minefield of psychological terror. Room 237 housed Marcus Webb, a 45-year-old man who had been admitted 6 months earlier after a complete mental breakdown. According to his file, Marcus had been a successful architect until he became obsessed with the idea that people were living inside the walls of buildings, watching and waiting for the right moment to emerge. His delusions had escalated to the point where he had torn apart his own home, ripping through drywall and insulation in search of the hidden observers he believed were documenting his every move. What made Marcus particularly unsettling was his intelligence and articulate nature. Unlike many patients who struggled with communication during psychotic episodes, Marcus could explain his beliefs with chilling clarity and logical progression. He would spend hours sketching architectural diagrams that showed elaborate tunnel systems and hidden chambers within ordinary buildings. His drawings were incredibly detailed and technically accurate, making his delusions seem almost plausible to anyone who spent too much time studying them. During my first encounter with Marcus, he had been sitting calmly at his desk, working on one of his architectural drawings. When I entered to deliver his evening medication, he looked up with eyes that seemed to pierce straight through me. "You can hear them too, can't you?" he asked in a voice barely above a whisper. "In the walls, behind the ceiling tiles, under the floorboards. They're always watching, always listening, always waiting." I maintained my professional demeanor and gently redirected the conversation, but something about his certainty made my skin crawl. The way he described the sounds, soft scraping, muffled footsteps, whispered conversations just below the threshold of normal hearing, matched things I had noticed during quiet moments on the night shift. I had always attributed these noises to the old building settling or the heating and cooling systems, but Marcus made me question whether there might be something more sinister at play. As weeks passed, Marcus became increasingly agitated during the night hours. He would pace his room for hours, pressing his ear against the walls and tapping on various surfaces as if searching for hollow spaces. Sometimes I would find him standing perfectly still in the center of his room, his head tilted at an unnatural angle, listening intently to something only he could hear. When I asked what he was doing, he would simply say, "They're moving tonight. Can't you feel the vibrations?" The other patients began to react to Marcus's behavior, becoming restless and anxious during their evening hours. Several complained of nightmares about being watched through the walls, and a few claimed they could hear scratching sounds coming from inside the building's structure. The day shift nurses reported no unusual incidents, but those of us working nights began to feel an oppressive atmosphere that seemed to grow stronger as the weeks progressed. One particularly quiet Tuesday night in October, I was making my rounds when I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. It was a soft, rhythmic tapping coming from somewhere within the walls of the corridor. The sound seemed to follow me as I walked, maintaining the same steady pace as my footsteps. I stopped several times to listen, and each time the tapping would continue for a few seconds before falling silent. I convinced myself it was just the building's aging infrastructure, but when I reached Marcus's room, I found him standing at his door with a knowing smile on his face. "You heard them tonight, didn't you?" he said without waiting for me to speak. "They're getting bolder. Soon everyone will know they're there." His certainty was so absolute, his expression so triumphant, that I felt a chill run down my spine. That night, I decided to investigate the areas of the building that Marcus claimed were inhabited by his mysterious watchers. Using my security access, I explored the maintenance areas, storage rooms, and utility corridors that ran parallel to the patient wards. Most of these spaces were dusty and obviously unused, but in one narrow corridor behind the main psychiatric ward, I discovered something that made me question everything I thought I knew about our hospital. The walls of this corridor were lined with small holes, each about the size of a quarter, drilled at eye level and spaced approximately 10 feet apart. The holes were professionally cut and appeared to have been there for some time, but they weren't marked on any of the building plans I had access to. More disturbing was the fact that each hole provided a direct line of sight into patient rooms throughout the psychiatric ward, including Marcus's room. I shined my flashlight through several of the holes and confirmed that they offered clear views of patient beds, seating areas, and doorways. Someone with access to this hidden corridor could observe patients without their knowledge, watching their most private and vulnerable moments. The discovery made me physically ill as I realized the implications of what I had found. The next morning, I reported my discovery to the hospital administration, but my concerns were met with skepticism and bureaucratic delays. The maintenance supervisor claimed the holes were part of an old ventilation system that had been abandoned decades earlier, but he couldn't produce any documentation to support this explanation. The hospital's chief of staff promised to investigate, but weeks passed without any visible action being taken. Meanwhile, Marcus's condition seemed to improve dramatically. He became calmer during the day, more cooperative with his treatment plan, and began engaging in group therapy sessions with renewed focus. His drawings shifted from paranoid architectural diagrams to more conventional sketches of landscapes and still life subjects. To the day shift staff, he appeared to be making significant progress toward recovery, but at night, his behavior told a different story. He would position himself at the small window in his door and stare directly at the spots where I had discovered the observation holes. Sometimes he would wave at the empty corridor as if greeting someone he recognized. When I asked him about this behavior, he would smile mysteriously and say, "They know that I know. We understand each other now." The situation came to a head on a Friday night in November when I was working alone due to staff shortages. Around 2 in the morning, I heard Marcus calling for me from his room, his voice urgent but not panicked. When I reached his door, I found him standing at his window, pointing toward the corridor where I had discovered the observation holes. "Look," he whispered intensely, "they're showing themselves tonight. This is what I've been waiting for." I followed his gaze but saw nothing unusual in the dimly lit corridor. The shadows looked the same as always, and there was no movement or sound to indicate the presence of another person. But as I stood there looking into the darkness, I began to notice something that made my heart rate accelerate. One of the shadows near the far end of the corridor seemed denser than the others, more defined and purposeful. As my eyes adjusted to the low light, the shadow appeared to have a human shape, standing perfectly still and facing in our direction. I blinked hard and looked again, but the shadow remained in the same position. My rational mind insisted it was just a trick of the lighting, a combination of architectural features and darkness that created the illusion of a human figure. But something primitive and instinctual in my brain was screaming that I was being watched by something that shouldn't be there. Marcus continued to stare into the corridor with an expression of vindication and strange satisfaction. "Do you see now?" he asked softly. "I was never crazy. They've always been there, studying us, learning from us. The question isn't whether they exist. It's what they want and why they've chosen to reveal themselves now. I wanted to call security, to report the possible intruder, but I was paralyzed by doubt and fear. What if I was experiencing the same delusions that had destroyed Marcus's life? What if the stress of working in the psychiatric ward was finally taking its toll on my own mental health? The thought of becoming a patient in the same facility where I worked was almost as terrifying as the possibility that Marcus's paranoid beliefs were actually based in reality. The shadow remained motionless for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Eventually, it seemed to dissolve back into the ordinary darkness of the corridor, leaving me questioning whether I had seen anything at all. Marcus returned to his bed with a peaceful expression, as if some long-awaited confirmation had finally been received. The following week, I requested a transfer to the day shift, citing personal reasons and family obligations that required me to work more conventional hours. My supervisor was understanding and accommodating, and within 2 weeks I was working the morning shift in the medical surgical unit. The transfer felt like an escape from a nightmare that I couldn't quite define or explain. Marcus was discharged from the hospital a month later, declared stable and ready to return to independent living with ongoing outpatient support. According to his discharge notes, he had made remarkable progress in addressing his paranoid delusions and had developed effective coping strategies for managing his anxiety. His treating psychiatrist described his recovery as one of the most successful cases she had encountered in her career. But I still think about that night when I stood in the corridor with Marcus, staring into shadows that might have been hiding something impossible to explain. I think about those carefully drilled observation holes and the feeling of being watched that permeated the night shift. Most of all, I think about the possibility that Marcus was never mentally ill at all, that he had simply become aware of something the rest of us were too scared or too skeptical to acknowledge. Sometimes, late at night in my own home, I catch myself listening for soft footsteps or muffled conversations that seem to come from within the walls themselves. I tell myself these sounds are just the normal settling of an old house, the expansion and contraction of building materials, or the movement of small animals in the attic. But part of me wonders if Marcus's watchers followed me home, if they've expanded their observation network beyond the confines of Riverside General Hospital. The rational part of my mind insists that I experienced a stress-induced hallucination brought on by working too many night shifts in a challenging environment. But the primitive part of my brain, the part that kept our ancestors alive by recognizing genuine threats in the darkness, continues to whisper that some delusions might actually be perceptions of hidden realities that most people are simply too afraid to see. The elevator operator. Downtown Pacific Tower was a 30-story office building that had been a landmark in our city since the 1960s. As one of the few remaining buildings with manually operated elevators, it attracted a unique clientele of businesses that appreciated its vintage charm and old-world craftsmanship. I had worked as the day shift elevator operator for 3 years, guiding businesspeople, clients, and visitors between floors in the building's ornate brass and mahogany elevator cars. The job was simple but required a specific skill set, knowledge of every tenant and floor, the ability to maintain pleasant conversation during short rides, and most importantly, the mechanical expertise to operate the vintage elevator systems safely and smoothly. Each of the building's 4 elevators had its own personality, subtle differences in how the controls responded, unique sounds that indicated proper operation, and quirks that could only be learned through experience. Elevator car number 3 was my favorite to operate. It was the smoothest of the 4, with controls that responded to the slightest touch and a motor that ran almost silently. The interior featured original Art Deco design elements that had been meticulously maintained, geometric patterns in the metalwork, rich wood paneling, and a small crystal chandelier that cast dancing light throughout the space. Passengers often commented on the car's elegance and beauty, and I took pride in keeping it spotless and perfectly functional. But car number 3 also had one feature that made it unique among the building's elevators. It could access a floor that didn't officially exist. Between the building's basement level and the first floor was a button marked B2 that appeared to serve a sub-basement area. However, according to all building plans and documentation, Pacific Tower had only one basement level that housed the mechanical systems, storage areas, and building management offices. During my first week on the job, I had asked my supervisor about the B2 button, but he had dismissed my question with a wave of his hand and a comment about old wiring from the original construction. The other elevator operators claimed they had never seen passengers request that floor, and the building's maintenance staff insisted that B2 was simply a defunct button that no longer connected to anything functional. Curiosity got the better of me one quiet afternoon when the building was nearly empty due to a citywide holiday. I was alone in car number 3, returning to the ground floor after dropping off a late working accountant on the 15th floor, when I decided to press the mysterious B2 button. To my surprise, the elevator responded immediately, descending past the basement level and coming to a smooth stop at what appeared to be a fully functional floor. The doors opened to reveal a corridor that looked completely different from the rest of Pacific Tower. Instead of the building's characteristic warm wood and brass finishes, this level featured stark white walls, industrial lighting, and polished concrete floors. The air smelled of disinfectant and had a sterile quality that reminded me of a medical facility or research laboratory. The corridor stretched in both directions from the elevator bank, with doors marked only with numbers rather than the business names and suite descriptions found on the upper floors. I stepped out of the elevator for a closer look, making sure to keep one foot in the doorway to prevent the car from leaving without me. The corridor was completely silent, with no sounds of human activity or mechanical systems. The fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead, and I could hear the faint vibration of air circulation systems, but there were no voices, footsteps, or office equipment sounds that would normally indicate an occupied business space. The doors along the corridor were made of heavy steel with small windows that had been painted over from the inside, making it impossible to see into the rooms beyond. Each door had a simple numeric label, 201, 202, 203, and so on, but no other identifying information. There were no company directories, nameplates, or signs that might indicate what kind of businesses or activities occupied this mysterious floor. After a few minutes of exploration, I returned to the elevator and pressed the button for the ground floor, but nothing happened. I tried pressing other floor buttons, but car number 3 seemed to be frozen at the B2 level. The controls that had always been so responsive and reliable were now completely unresponsive to my commands. A wave of panic washed over me as I realized I might be trapped in this strange sub-basement with no way to call for help. I spent the next 20 minutes frantically pressing buttons, checking the emergency phone, and trying every troubleshooting technique I had learned during my training. Just as I was beginning to consider the possibility of having to walk up 30 flights of stairs through the building's emergency stairwells, the elevator suddenly came back to life. The controls responded normally, and I was able to return to the ground floor without any further issues. When I reported the incident to my supervisor, he seemed genuinely surprised to learn that the B2 button was actually functional. He promised to have the building's maintenance team investigate the issue, but when I asked about it again a week later, he claimed that the maintenance staff had found nothing unusual, and that the B2 button was simply a remnant from the building's original construction that occasionally experienced electrical glitches. Despite this explanation, I found myself increasingly curious about the mysterious sub-basement level. Over the following weeks, I began paying closer attention to the passengers who rode in car number 3, looking for any indication that someone might be accessing the B2 floor. Most of the building's tenants were familiar to me after 3 years on the job, and their daily routines were predictable and consistent. But I started noticing a few passengers who didn't fit the normal patterns. These individuals were always well-dressed and professional-looking, but they carried themselves with a sense of purpose and urgency that seemed different from typical office workers. They would enter the elevator, nod politely when I greeted them, but never make conversation or provide any indication of their destination. Most strangely, they would simply stand quietly during the ride, never pressing a button or requesting a specific floor. At first, I assumed these silent passengers were simply shy or preoccupied with work-related concerns. But as I began watching more carefully, I realized that these individuals seemed to disappear from the elevator without me noticing when or how they exited. I would remember them entering the car, recall the ride beginning, but have no memory of stopping at any floor or seeing them leave. This pattern continued for several weeks, with the mysterious passengers appearing irregularly but consistently. They were never the same person twice, but they all shared similar characteristics: professional attire, quiet demeanor, and an unusual quality that made them seem somehow separate from the normal flow of building traffic. I began to wonder if these individuals were connected to whatever activities were taking place on the B2 level. My curiosity eventually overcame my caution, and I decided to make another unauthorized visit to the mysterious sub-basement. This time, I waited until the end of my shift when the building was nearly empty, and I made sure to bring a small flashlight and my cell phone in case of emergency. The elevator responded to the B2 button exactly as it had before, descending smoothly to the hidden floor and opening its doors to reveal the same sterile white corridor. This second visit was different from my first exploration. As I stepped into the corridor, I could hear faint sounds coming from behind some of the numbered doors, the soft hum of electronic equipment, occasional beeping sounds that might have been computers or medical devices, and what sounded like muffled conversations between multiple people. The sub-basement level was clearly occupied and actively used, despite the building management's claims that it didn't exist. I walked further down the corridor than I had during my first visit, discovering that it formed a complete loop around what appeared to be a central core area. There were at least 20 numbered doors, suggesting that the B2 level was as large and complex as any of the building's upper floors. At several points along the corridor, I found additional elevator banks and stairwell entrances that weren't connected to the building's main circulation systems. The most unsettling discovery came when I reached what appeared to be the facility's main entrance area. Unlike the numbered doors that lined the corridor, this area featured a reception desk, waiting area, and large glass doors that led to what looked like a lobby or conference space. The furniture was modern and expensive, suggesting that this was a legitimate business operation rather than some kind of abandoned or unofficial space. But what made my blood run cold was the realization that the reception area was occupied. I could see the silhouette of a person sitting behind the reception desk, apparently working at a computer or reading documents. The individual appeared to be wearing professional attire and seemed completely absorbed in their tasks. I immediately retreated, not wanting to be discovered exploring an area where I clearly didn't belong. As I hurried back toward car number 3, I began to hear footsteps in the corridor behind me. The sound was measured and purposeful, suggesting that someone was following me rather than simply walking in the same direction. I increased my pace, trying to reach the elevator before whoever was behind me could catch up, but the footsteps seemed to match my speed exactly. When I finally reached the elevator, I frantically pressed the button for the ground floor, but once again the controls seemed to be unresponsive. I could hear the footsteps getting closer, and panic began to set in as I realized I might be confronted by whoever operated the mysterious B2 facility. I pressed the emergency call button, hoping to summon help from the building's security office, but the communication system seemed to be non-functional. Just as the footsteps sounded like they were directly behind me, the elevator suddenly lurched into motion, carrying me upward toward the building's main floors. I never saw who had been following me in the corridor, and by the time I reached the ground floor, my heart was pounding so hard that I had to sit down in the building's lobby to recover my composure. The next day, I submitted my resignation to the building management company, citing personal reasons and the need to pursue other career opportunities. I didn't mention my discoveries on the B2 level, partly because I doubted anyone would believe me, and partly because I was genuinely frightened by what I had witnessed. The thought of continuing to work in a building that housed some kind of secret facility was too unsettling for me to ignore. My replacement was a young man named David, who had previous experience operating vintage elevators in historic buildings. During my final week of training him, I considered warning him about the B2 level and the mysterious passengers, but I ultimately decided that he would be safer if he remained unaware of the building's hidden secrets. 6 months after leaving Pacific Tower, I learned that David had been found dead in elevator car number 3 under circumstances that the police were unable to explain. According to the news reports, he had apparently suffered a heart attack while operating the elevator late one evening, but the medical examiner was puzzled by the fact that a healthy 26-year-old with no history of cardiac problems would experience such a sudden and severe medical event. The building management company hired a new elevator operator and installed modern automatic systems in all 4 elevator cars, claiming that the manual operation had become too expensive and inefficient to maintain. Car number 3 was permanently taken out of service and sealed, with building management citing mechanical problems that made it unsafe for passenger use. But sometimes, late at night when I'm lying in bed trying to fall asleep, I think about that sterile white corridor and the mysterious people who inhabited the B2 level. I wonder what kind of business or research was being conducted in that hidden facility, and I wonder if David's death was really the result of a medical emergency or something far more sinister. Most of all, I wonder if those silent passengers are still riding the elevators in Pacific Tower, moving between floors that officially don't exist, conducting business that must never be acknowledged or understood by the ordinary people who work in the floors above them. The thought that such secrets can be hidden in plain sight, in the middle of a busy downtown office building, makes me question everything I thought I knew about the world around me. The school custodian. Jefferson Elementary School was built in 1952, and by the time I started working there as the night custodian, the building had accumulated 60 years of history, stories, and secrets within its brick walls and linoleum-floored corridors. The job was perfect for me. I preferred working alone, appreciated the quiet solitude of empty buildings, and took pride in maintaining clean, safe spaces for the children and teachers who would fill the classrooms each morning. My shift started at 6 in the evening, after the last of the after-school programs had ended and the building had emptied of students, teachers, and administrative staff. The routine was straightforward. Clean all classrooms, mop the hallways and common areas, empty trash receptacles, check that all windows and doors were secure, and ensure that the building was ready for another day of learning and activity. The school consisted of 2 main wings connected by a central administration area that housed the principal's office, main lobby, and cafeteria. The East Wing contained the primary grades, kindergarten through 2nd grade, while the West Wing housed 3rd through 5th grade classrooms. Each wing had its own character and atmosphere, shaped by the age and energy of the children who spent their days there. What made Jefferson Elementary unique among the schools in our district was its basement level, which contained not only the standard mechanical rooms and storage areas, but also a series of classrooms that had been used for various purposes throughout the building's history. These basement rooms had served as art studios, music practice spaces, remedial education areas, and temporary classrooms during periods when enrollment exceeded the building's main capacity. By the time I started working at Jefferson, most of the basement classrooms had been converted to storage space for outdated textbooks, broken furniture, and school supplies that accumulated over decades of educational evolution. Only one basement classroom remained in active use, Room B7, which served as a meeting space for parent-teacher conferences and small group activities that required privacy from the main school environment. Room B7 was located at the end of a long corridor that stretched the full length of the school's foundation. The room was larger than the standard classrooms upstairs and featured high ceilings, large windows that were partially below ground level, and original hardwood floors that had been installed when the school was first constructed. Despite its basement location, the room had a pleasant atmosphere and was often requested by teachers for special events and meetings. During my first few weeks on the job, I noticed that Room B7 seemed to generate more cleaning tasks than other areas of the building. The trash receptacles were always full, despite the fact that the room was rarely used during school hours. The windows frequently showed handprints and smudges that required extra attention, and the floors often displayed scuff marks and dirt patterns that suggested heavy foot traffic. I initially attributed these issues to the room's occasional use for evening meetings and community events that took place after my shift had ended. Parent-teacher conferences, school board meetings, and PTA gatherings were sometimes held in the basement classroom, and I assumed that the additional wear and tear was simply the result of adult activity in a space primarily designed for children. But as weeks turned into months, I began to notice patterns that didn't align with the school's official calendar of events. Room B7 would show signs of recent use on nights when no meetings had been scheduled, and the type of debris I found in the classroom didn't match what I would expect from typical school activities. Instead of the usual paper scraps, pencil shavings, and food wrappers that characterized most classrooms, Room B7 often contained unusual items. Small plastic toys that didn't match the school's approved educational materials, candy wrappers from brands that weren't sold in the school's vending machines, and occasionally pieces of adult clothing like buttons, cufflinks, or small jewelry items. More puzzling were the drawings and writings that I would sometimes find on the room's whiteboard. Unlike the typical student work that filled classrooms throughout the building, these markings were sophisticated and detailed, featuring complex diagrams, mathematical equations, and text written in multiple languages. Some of the drawings appeared to be architectural plans or engineering schematics, while others resembled medical diagrams or scientific illustrations. The handwriting was clearly that of adults rather than children, and the subject matter was far beyond what would be appropriate for elementary school students. I would carefully erase these markings each night, assuming they were left over from evening meetings or adult education classes that I wasn't aware of, but they would reappear with disturbing regularity. My curiosity about Room B7's mysterious activities finally overcame my professional discretion one evening in October. Instead of following my usual cleaning routine, I decided to position myself in a storage closet across the hall from the classroom and observe whether anyone entered the room during my shift. I brought a book and a small flashlight, settling in for what I expected to be a long and probably fruitless vigil. Around 9:30 in the evening, I heard the sound of footsteps in the basement corridor. Multiple people were walking purposefully toward Room B7, their voices low and indistinct, but clearly engaged in serious conversation. I carefully peered through the crack between the closet door and frame, watching as a group of 5 adults approached the classroom. The individuals were well-dressed and professional-looking, carrying briefcases and folders that suggested they were attending some kind of business meeting. They appeared to be in their 30s and 40s, and they moved with the confidence and urgency of people who had important work to accomplish. One person produced a key and unlocked the classroom door, and the group disappeared inside. For the next 2 hours, I could hear muffled voices, the sound of chairs being moved, and occasional periods of what sounded like heated discussion or debate. At one point, I heard what appeared to be electronic equipment being operated, beeping sounds, mechanical humming, and the distinctive whine of electronic devices under operation. The activity level suggested that Room B7 was being used for purposes far more complex and sophisticated than typical school meetings. Around 11:30, the group emerged from the classroom, their conversation continuing as they walked back down the corridor toward the basement's main stairwell. I waited until I was certain they had left the building before emerging from my hiding place and investigating what they had been doing in Room B7. The classroom had been completely transformed. The desks and chairs had been rearranged to create a conference-style seating arrangement around several folding tables that hadn't been in the room earlier. The tables were covered with documents, photographs, maps, and what appeared to be technical equipment, including laptops, measuring devices, and communication equipment that looked far more advanced than anything the school district would typically purchase. Most disturbing were the photographs that were scattered across one of the tables. The images showed various locations throughout our city, but they appeared to have been taken covertly, with subjects who were unaware they were being photographed. Some photos showed the interiors of homes, businesses, and other schools, while others focused on specific individuals going about their daily routines. The photos were professionally taken and had been organized into folders labeled with names, addresses, and what appeared to be case numbers. I quickly realized that I was looking at evidence of some kind of surveillance operation that was using Jefferson Elementary School as a base of operations. The sophisticated equipment, covert photography, and secretive nature of the meetings suggested that the activities taking place in room B7 were far from innocent adult education or community meetings. My first instinct was to call the police, but I hesitated because I wasn't certain whether what I was witnessing was illegal or simply inappropriate. The individuals using the classroom could have been law enforcement officers, private investigators, or government agents conducting legitimate surveillance activities. Alternatively, they could have been engaged in criminal activities that posed a threat to the community's safety and privacy. I decided to document what I had seen by taking photographs of the materials in the classroom, but as I reached for my cell phone, I heard footsteps in the corridor outside. Someone was returning to the classroom, and I had no legitimate reason to be there examining materials that were clearly intended to be confidential. I quickly turned off the classroom lights and hid behind a filing cabinet in the back corner of the room, hoping that whoever was returning would collect their materials and leave quickly. The footsteps approached the classroom door, paused for a moment, and then continued down the corridor without entering the room. I waited for several more minutes before carefully making my way back to the storage closet where I had been conducting my surveillance. The next morning, when I arrived at work to finish my cleaning duties before the school day began, room B7 had been completely restored to its normal appearance. All traces of the previous night's activities had been removed, and the classroom looked exactly as it had before the mysterious meeting. The arrangement of desks and chairs was back to normal, and there were no documents, photographs, or electronic equipment to be found anywhere in the room. Over the following weeks, I paid careful attention to room B7, looking for any indication that the surveillance meetings were continuing. The classroom showed the same signs of irregular use that I had noticed before, but I never again witnessed the arrival and departure of the mysterious group. However, I did notice that other areas of the school began showing signs of unusual activity. I started finding similar materials in other locations throughout the building. Photographs hidden in supply closets, technical equipment stored in unused classrooms, and documents tucked behind filing cabinets in the administrative offices. It became clear that the surveillance operation was not limited to room B7, but was using the entire school as a base for activities that extended throughout our community. The situation came to a head in November, when I discovered that my own apartment building was among the locations being photographed and monitored. Mixed in with surveillance materials I found in a basement storage room were several photos of my building's entrance, parking area, and even the windows of specific apartments, including my own. The realization that I was being watched by the same people who were using my workplace as their operational base was terrifying and infuriating. I finally decided to contact the police, but when the officers arrived to investigate my claims, they found no evidence of any surveillance equipment or materials anywhere in the school. Room B7 and all other areas I had mentioned were completely clean and normal, showing no signs of the activities I had witnessed. The officers were polite but clearly skeptical, and their report classified my concerns as unfounded allegations based on insufficient evidence. The school principal was understanding but concerned about my mental health and stress levels. She suggested that the isolation and monotony of night shift work might be causing me to imagine things that weren't actually happening, and she recommended that I consider requesting a transfer to a day shift position at one of the district's other facilities. I submitted my resignation the following week, unable to continue working in a building where I felt constantly watched and unable to trust what was real versus what might be products of my imagination. The uncertainty about whether I had witnessed genuine surveillance activities or experienced some kind of stress-induced hallucinations was almost as troubling as the original discoveries. My replacement was a retired maintenance worker named Frank, who had decades of experience working in school buildings throughout the district. When I met with him during the transition period, I considered warning him about the unusual activities I had witnessed, but I ultimately decided that he would be better served discovering the truth for himself rather than being influenced by my potentially unreliable observations. Frank lasted exactly 3 weeks in the position before submitting his own resignation, citing personal reasons and health concerns that made the night shift unsuitable for his needs. His replacement lasted even less time, and within 6 months, The district had converted the custodial position to a day shift role with additional staff to ensure that the building was never left unsupervised during evening hours. Jefferson Elementary School was closed permanently the following year due to declining enrollment and budget constraints, despite the fact that other schools in the district with similar enrollment numbers remained open. The building was sold to a private development company that demolished it within months of the purchase, citing structural problems and environmental concerns that made renovation impractical. But sometimes, when I drive past the empty lot where Jefferson Elementary used to stand, I wonder whether the surveillance operation I witnessed was connected to the school's sudden closure and demolition. I wonder if the activities taking place in room B7 were part of something larger and more sinister than simple community surveillance. And I wonder if the building was destroyed to eliminate evidence of whatever had been conducted there. Most of all, I wonder if Frank and the other custodians who briefly worked at Jefferson experienced the same discoveries that drove me to resign, and whether the district's decision to eliminate night shift positions was based on staffing difficulties or the need to prevent future witnesses from discovering the school's hidden secrets. The uncertainty has never left me, and the experience has changed how I view the familiar institutions and buildings that surround us every day. Schools, offices, community centers, and other public spaces that we assume are safe and transparent might be hiding activities that would shock and terrify us if we knew the truth about what happens when the lights go out and the official activities come to an end. The apartment building super. The Grandview Apartments was a 6-story brick building constructed in the 1920s that housed 48 units and a diverse community of tenants ranging from young professionals to elderly retirees who had lived there for decades. As the building superintendent, I was responsible for maintenance, repairs, security, and serving as the primary point of contact between tenants and the property management company that owned the building. The job came with a small apartment in the basement level, which suited my preference for privacy and gave me easy access to the mechanical systems, storage areas, and utility rooms that required regular attention. The basement was a maze of corridors and rooms that reflected the building's long history. Original storage spaces, converted utility areas, and rooms that had been added over the decades as the building's needs evolved. Most of the basement was functional and well maintained, housing the boiler, electrical panels, water heaters, and storage areas for each apartment unit. But there was one section of the basement that had always puzzled me, a corridor that led to a series of rooms that didn't appear on any of the building's floor plans or architectural drawings. These rooms were accessible through a heavy wooden door that was usually locked, but I had discovered the key among a collection of old keys left by my predecessor. The rooms beyond the locked door were clean and well maintained, despite the fact that they weren't officially part of the building's layout. They contained furniture, equipment, and personal belongings that suggested they were actively used by someone, but I had never seen any tenants or visitors accessing this area. The electricity and plumbing worked perfectly, and the rooms showed signs of regular occupancy, including fresh linens, recently used dishes, and personal items arranged as if someone lived there permanently. What made these hidden rooms particularly unsettling was their resemblance to exact replicas of several apartments in the building above. The furniture, decorations, color schemes, and even personal photographs matched specific units on the upper floors with eerie precision. It was as if someone had created detailed copies of tenants' homes in the basement, complete with intimate details that could only be known through extensive observation and surveillance. The most disturbing replica was of Mrs. Chen's apartment on the 4th floor. Mrs. Chen was a 72-year-old retired librarian who had lived in the building for 15 years and was known for her kindness, generosity, and involvement in community activities. The basement replica of her apartment included not only her furniture and decorations, but also personal items like family photographs, handwritten letters, and even clothing that matched garments I had seen her wearing. I began paying closer attention to the tenants whose apartments had been replicated in the basement, looking for any signs that they were aware of the surveillance or duplication of their living spaces. But Mrs. Chen, along with the other affected tenants, seemed completely normal and unaware that their most private spaces had been meticulously recreated beneath their feet. The situation became more complex when I realized that the basement replicas were not static displays, but were being actively maintained and updated to match changes in the real apartments above. When Mrs. Chen rearranged her living room furniture, the basement replica was modified to match the new layout within days. When she replaced her kitchen curtains, identical curtains appeared in the basement version of her apartment. This level of surveillance and duplication required someone with regular access to the tenants' apartments, detailed knowledge of their personal belongings, and the resources to acquire identical furniture, decorations, and personal items. The implications were terrifying. Someone was conducting extensive surveillance of multiple tenants, creating perfect replicas of their homes, and maintaining these secret spaces without anyone's knowledge or consent. I considered confronting the property management company about my discoveries, but I was concerned about the potential consequences of revealing that I had been exploring areas of the building that were presumably off-limits. I was also worried about the safety of the tenants who were being surveilled, particularly Mrs. Chan and the other elderly residents who would be most vulnerable to any malicious intentions. Instead, I decided to conduct my own investigation, carefully documenting the basement rooms and trying to determine who was responsible for creating and maintaining them. I installed a small security camera in the corridor leading to the hidden area, hoping to capture evidence of whoever was accessing the replica apartments. The camera revealed a disturbing pattern of activity. Several times each week, usually during the late evening or early morning hours, individuals would enter the basement area and spend hours in the replica apartments. These people appeared to be studying the spaces, examining personal belongings, and in some cases, practicing movements and activities as if they were rehearsing for something. Most disturbing was watching someone spend an entire night in the replica of Mrs. Chen's apartment, going through the motions of her daily routine, preparing tea in her kitchen, sitting in her favorite chair while reading, and even sleeping in a bed that was an exact duplicate of her own. The individual appeared to be learning Mrs. Chen's habits and lifestyle with an intensity that suggested preparation for identity theft, fraud, or something even more sinister. I finally decided that the safety of the tenants outweighed my job security concerns, and I contacted the police to report my discoveries. The initial response was skeptical. The idea that someone had created perfect replicas of apartments in a building's basement sounded too bizarre to be credible. But when the officers agreed to investigate and saw the hidden rooms for themselves, they immediately recognized the serious criminal implications of what I had uncovered. The investigation revealed that the building was being used as a training facility for an identity theft ring that specialized in targeting elderly victims. The basement replicas allowed criminals to study their victims' homes, personal belongings, and daily routines in detail, enabling them to pose as family members, caregivers, or service providers when approaching the elderly tenants. The operation was more sophisticated than anyone had initially realized. The criminals had been using their detailed knowledge of the victims' apartments to gain entry by posing as maintenance workers, utility inspectors, or delivery personnel who would know specific details about the tenants' living spaces that would establish credibility and trust. Several tenants, including Mrs. Chen, had been victimized over the months preceding my discovery, losing thousands of dollars to scams that relied on the criminals' intimate knowledge of their personal lives, financial situations, and daily routines. The psychological impact on the elderly victims was devastating, as they struggled to understand how strangers had known such specific details about their private lives. The property management company claimed complete ignorance of the basement operation and cooperated fully with the investigation, but several employees were eventually charged with conspiracy and fraud for providing the criminals with access to tenant apartments and personal information. The building was sold within 6 months, and most of the tenants moved to other locations, unable to feel safe in a place where their privacy had been so completely violated. Mrs. Chen moved to an assisted living facility where she could receive additional security and support, but she never fully recovered from the trauma of learning that her home had been replicated and studied by criminals who used that knowledge to exploit her trust and steal her savings. The violation of her personal space and privacy had a profound impact on her mental health and quality of life. I found a new job as a maintenance worker at a small office building, but the experience at Grandview Apartments changed my perspective on privacy, security, and the potential for hidden surveillance in places where we should feel most safe. The idea that criminals could gain such intimate access to people's homes and lives, using that knowledge to exploit vulnerable victims, was a sobering reminder of how sophisticated modern crime has become. The investigation eventually led to arrests and convictions of 12 individuals involved in the identity theft ring, but it was impossible to determine how many other buildings or communities might have been similarly compromised. The case highlighted the need for better security measures in residential buildings and greater awareness among elderly residents about the sophisticated methods used by modern criminals. But what haunts me most about the Grandview Apartments case is the realization that Mrs. Chen and the other victims lived for months above perfect replicas of their own homes, unaware that every detail of their private lives was being studied and catalogued by people who intended to harm them. The violation was complete and invisible, making it all the more disturbing and traumatic when it was finally discovered. The night security guard. Westfield Shopping Centre had been the heart of our suburban community for over 20 years, housing more than 80 stores, restaurants, and service businesses that served the daily needs of thousands of customers. As the overnight security guard, my job was to protect the mall during the vulnerable hours between closing and opening, ensuring that the facility remained secure while the stores were empty and unattended. The position required walking regular patrols through all areas of the mall, monitoring security cameras, checking that all store gates were properly secured, and responding to any alarms or unusual incidents that might occur during the night shift. The work was generally routine and peaceful, with most nights passing without any significant events or security concerns. The mall consisted of 2 main levels connected by escalators, elevators, and a grand staircase in the central court area. The upper level housed primarily clothing stores, electronics retailers, and specialty shops, while the lower level contained the food court, anchor department stores, and service businesses like banks and mobile phone stores. During business hours, the space was filled with shoppers, families, and the bustling energy of commercial activity, but at night it became a vast, echoing cavern of darkened storefronts and empty corridors. What made Westfield unique among the shopping centers in our region was its unusually complex layout of service corridors, storage areas, and mechanical spaces that allowed employees and deliveries to move throughout the facility without interfering with customer areas. These behind-the-scenes spaces formed an intricate network that connected every store and restaurant, providing access for maintenance, security, and emergency services. During my first few weeks on the job, I spent considerable time learning the layout of these service areas, as they were essential for conducting thorough security patrols and responding quickly to any problems that might arise. The corridors were well lit and clearly marked, with color-coded signs that indicated different sections and emergency exit routes. Most of the space was functional and unremarkable, housing electrical panels, storage rooms, and access points for the building's various systems. But there was one section of the service corridors that seemed different from the rest of the facility. Located beneath the mall's central court area, this section featured a series of rooms that appeared to be unused retail spaces, complete storefronts with display windows, cash register areas, and storage rooms that looked ready for occupancy but had never been leased to any businesses. These vacant storefronts were pristine and fully finished, with polished floors, painted walls, and complete electrical and plumbing systems. They looked exactly like the active retail spaces throughout the mall, but they were located in areas that were inaccessible to customers and had never appeared on any leasing plans or mall directories. It was as if an entire section of the shopping center had been built and then forgotten, hidden away from the public areas but maintained in perfect condition. I initially assumed that these spaces were intended for future expansion or had been held in reserve for potential tenants who had never materialized. The mall's management office had keys to all of these areas, and they appeared on some of the building's architectural drawings, so they seemed to be legitimate parts of the facility's design even if they weren't currently in use. But as weeks turned into months, I began to notice that these hidden storefronts showed signs of regular activity despite their supposedly vacant status. The floors were always clean, the air circulation systems were running, and occasionally I would find evidence that someone had been in these spaces recently. Fresh coffee cups, scattered papers, or equipment that hadn't been there during previous patrols. More puzzling was the discovery that several of these hidden storefronts contained merchandise, cash registers, and business equipment that suggested they were functioning retail operations. The displays were professionally arranged, the inventory was extensive and current, and the cash registers appeared to be connected to the mall's central payment processing systems. But these stores were never open during regular business hours, they didn't appear on any mall directories or maps, and there were no signs or advertisements that would indicate their existence to customers. They seemed to be fully operational retail businesses that existed in secret, conducting transactions and serving customers in ways that were completely invisible to the general public. The situation became more mystifying when I realized that the merchandise in these hidden stores was identical to items sold in the mall's regular retail spaces. Clothing stores contained the same brands and styles available in the public shops. Electronic stores featured the same products and accessories, and even the pricing appeared to match what was charged in the visible businesses. This discovery led me to suspect that the hidden storefronts were somehow connected to the mall's regular retailers, perhaps serving as storage areas, distribution centers, or testing locations for new products and marketing strategies. But the level of sophistication and the apparent customer activity suggested that these spaces were serving a more complex purpose than simple storage or research. My curiosity was finally satisfied one Friday night in November, when I decided to position myself near the hidden retail section during the early evening hours, just after the mall had closed to regular customers. I found a concealed observation point in one of the service corridors where I could monitor the entrance to the hidden storefronts without being easily detected. Around 9 o'clock, approximately an hour after the mall's official closing time, I began to see activity in the hidden retail section. Groups of people were entering the area through service entrances that I had assumed were only used by employees and maintenance staff. These individuals appeared to be customers, families with children, couples, and individual shoppers carrying bags and moving through the spaces exactly as if they were shopping in a normal retail environment. Over the next several hours, I watched as dozens of people shopped in the hidden stores, trying on clothing, examining electronics, purchasing food from restaurants that officially didn't exist, and conducting all the normal activities associated with a busy shopping center. The people appeared to be ordinary customers, but they were shopping in a parallel version of the mall that was completely invisible to the general public. The most unsettling aspect of this discovery was the realization that these secret customers seemed to know exactly where they were going and what they were looking for. They moved through the hidden retail areas with familiarity and purpose, suggesting that this parallel shopping experience was a regular occurrence rather than a one-time event or special promotion. I continued to observe the hidden shopping activity for several more weeks, documenting the patterns and trying to understand who these secret customers were and how they gained access to the concealed retail spaces. The activity occurred on specific nights each week, always after the mall's official closing time, and always involved the same general types of customers and shopping behaviors. The breakthrough in my understanding came when I recognized several of the secret shoppers as people I had seen during regular business hours in the mall's public areas. These were not completely separate groups of customers, but rather regular shoppers who were returning to the mall during off hours to access the hidden retail spaces. This realization led me to investigate the relationship between the public and hidden stores, and I discovered that the secret shopping areas offered significant discounts on the same merchandise available in the regular retail spaces. Customers who qualified for access to the hidden stores could purchase the same products at substantially reduced prices, apparently as part of some kind of exclusive membership or loyalty program. The system was incredibly sophisticated, with separate payment processing, inventory management, and customer service operations that allowed the hidden stores to function as completely independent retail businesses while remaining invisible to customers who only shopped during regular hours. The discounted merchandise was apparently made possible by reduced overhead costs, since the hidden stores didn't require the same level of staffing, security, or marketing as the public retail spaces. But the exclusive nature of the program and the secrecy surrounding it raised questions about fairness, transparency, and the potential for discrimination in who was allowed access to the discounted merchandise. The hidden shopping system appeared to create two different classes of customers: those who paid full price during regular hours, and those who qualified for substantial discounts through the secret after-hours program. I eventually reported my discoveries to the mall's management office, but their response was dismissive and evasive. They claimed that the after-hours activity I had observed was simply inventory management, employee training, and maintenance activities that were necessary to keep the mall operating efficiently. They insisted that there were no hidden stores or secret customer programs, and they suggested that I had misinterpreted normal business operations as something more mysterious. When I pressed for more specific explanations and offered to show them the areas where I had observed the secret shopping activities, the management company suddenly began questioning my performance and reliability as a security guard. They suggested that the overnight shift might be causing stress and fatigue that was affecting my perception and judgment, and they recommended that I consider requesting a transfer to a day shift position at one of their other properties. I realized that further investigation or questions about the hidden retail operations would likely result in my termination, so I decided to quietly document what I had observed and seek employment elsewhere. But before leaving Westfield Shopping Center, I made one final discovery that clarified the true nature of what I had been witnessing. Hidden among the administrative offices in the service corridor areas, I found documentation that revealed the secret shopping program was actually a sophisticated market research operation conducted by a major retail consulting firm. The after-hours customers were participating in studies that measured shopping behaviors, product preferences, and price sensitivity by allowing them to shop in controlled environments that duplicated normal retail conditions while providing access to detailed data about their choices and purchasing patterns. The hidden stores were elaborate testing facilities that allowed researchers to study consumer behavior without the subjects being aware they were participating in market research. The discounted merchandise was an incentive to encourage participation, and the secrecy was necessary to ensure that the research subject's behavior remained natural and uninfluenced by awareness of the study. While the market research explanation was less sinister than some of the possibilities I had considered, it still raised serious questions about informed consent, privacy, and the ethics of conducting research on consumers without their knowledge. The people shopping in the hidden stores believed they were simply accessing an exclusive discount program, not participating in detailed behavioral studies that would inform marketing strategies used throughout the retail industry. I left my position at Westfield Shopping Center with a deeper understanding of how sophisticated market research has become, and how consumers' most private choices and behaviors can be studied and analyzed without their awareness or consent. The experience made me more conscious of the ways that seemingly ordinary commercial spaces might be designed to gather information and influence behavior in ways that are completely invisible to the people being studied. The mall continued operating normally after my departure, and the hidden retail spaces presumably continued serving their dual purpose as both discount shopping venues and sophisticated research facilities. But I never returned to shop at Westfield, unable to feel comfortable in a space where I knew that every purchase, every movement, and every decision might be monitored and recorded for purposes that customers would never understand or consent to if they knew the truth. The delivery driver. Working as a delivery driver for quick-serve logistics meant spending long hours navigating the city streets, delivering packages to businesses, homes, and institutions throughout the metropolitan area. The job required efficiency, reliability, and the ability to find addresses in every neighborhood from wealthy suburbs to industrial districts that most people never visited. My route typically included 40 to 60 deliveries per day, ranging from small envelopes and documents to large packages containing everything from electronics to medical supplies. The variety kept the work interesting, and I took pride in providing reliable service to customers who depended on timely deliveries for their personal and professional needs. Most of my deliveries were routine and unremarkable, but there was one address that appeared on my route with unusual frequency, and always involved packages that seemed different from the standard commercial and personal shipments I normally handled. The address was 1247 Industrial Way, a nondescript warehouse building in a section of the city that housed primarily manufacturing and distribution businesses. The packages destined for 1247 Industrial Way were always small, sealed with excessive amounts of tape, and labeled with handling instructions that seemed unusually cautious for standard commercial shipments. They were marked "fragile," "handle with care," and "temperature sensitive" in multiple languages, and they always required signature confirmation from a specific recipient rather than being left with any available person at the location. What made these deliveries particularly memorable was the building itself and the people who worked there. Unlike the busy loading docks and bustling activity that characterized most industrial facilities, 1247 Industrial Way appeared to be nearly empty most of the time. The building was large enough to house a significant operation, but there were rarely more than 2 or 3 vehicles in the parking lot, and I seldom saw any signs of the normal shipping and receiving activity that would be expected at a warehouse location. The person who signed for packages at 1247 Industrial Way was always the same individual, a middle-aged man named Dr. Harrison, who wore a white lab coat and carried himself with the serious demeanor of someone involved in scientific or medical work. He was polite but distant, always eager to receive the packages quickly and return to whatever work was taking place inside the building. Dr. Harrison never made small talk or provided any indication of what kind of business operated at the facility, and the building itself offered no clues about its purpose. There were no company signs, advertising, or other identifying information visible from the outside, and the windows were tinted or covered in ways that prevented any view of the interior spaces. Over the months that I delivered packages to 1247 Industrial Way, I began to notice patterns that suggested the facility was involved in activities that required unusual levels of secrecy and security. The packages always arrived from different shipping locations throughout the country, never from the same sender twice, and they were always addressed to Dr. Harrison personally rather than to any company or organization name. The timing of deliveries was also unusual. Dr. Harrison seemed to know exactly when packages were scheduled to arrive, often waiting near the building's entrance before I had even pulled into the parking lot. This level of anticipation suggested that the deliveries were critical to whatever work was being conducted inside the facility, and that any delays could have serious consequences. My curiosity about the mysterious warehouse was finally satisfied one afternoon when I arrived to make a delivery and found the building's loading dock door standing open. As I approached with the package, I could see into the interior of the facility for the first time, and what I observed challenged everything I had assumed about the building's purpose. Instead of the warehouse space I had expected, the interior was configured as a sophisticated laboratory filled with scientific equipment, computer workstations, and what appeared to be medical or research apparatus. People in white lab coats were working at various stations, handling materials with the careful precision required for sensitive scientific procedures. Most disturbing was the presence of what appeared to be medical examination areas, complete with hospital-style beds, monitoring equipment, and supplies that suggested the facility was involved in human research or experimentation. The combination of scientific equipment and medical facilities created an atmosphere that was both impressive and deeply unsettling. Dr. Harrison quickly closed the loading dock door when he noticed that I could see into the facility, and he accepted the delivery with more urgency than usual. He made it clear that he preferred to conduct all future deliveries at the building's front entrance rather than at the loading dock, where there was less visibility into the interior spaces. This glimpse into the mysterious laboratory made me pay even closer attention to the packages I delivered to 1247 Industrial Way. The shipping labels often indicated that the contents were biological materials, pharmaceutical products, or scientific instruments that required special handling and temperature control. Some packages were marked with biohazard symbols or other warnings that suggested potentially dangerous contents. The realization that I was regularly delivering sensitive scientific and medical materials to an unlicensed and unofficial research facility raised serious questions about the legality and safety of whatever work was being conducted there. The secrecy surrounding the operation, combined with the sophisticated equipment and medical facilities, suggested that the research might involve human subjects or dangerous materials that required proper oversight and regulation. I began documenting the packages I delivered to 1247 Industrial Way, noting the shipping origins, contents descriptions, and any unusual handling requirements. The materials came from universities, pharmaceutical companies, medical supply distributors, and research institutions throughout the country, suggesting that the facility was connected to a network of legitimate scientific organizations, even though its own operations appeared to be conducted in secret. The situation became more concerning when I recognized some of the sender addresses as facilities that had been mentioned in news reports about unethical medical research, unauthorized clinical trials, and violations of patient safety regulations. The connection between these problematic institutions and the mysterious laboratory raised the possibility that 1247 Industrial Way was serving as a location where banned or restricted research could be conducted away from regulatory oversight. My concerns about the facility were validated when I discovered that several of the packages I had delivered contained materials that were supposed to be restricted to licensed medical professionals and authorized research institutions. Controlled substances, experimental pharmaceuticals, and biological samples that required special permits and oversight were being routinely shipped to the unlicensed laboratory without any apparent regulatory supervision. I eventually reported my observations to the appropriate regulatory agencies, providing documentation of the unusual deliveries and describing what I had observed about the facility's operations. The initial response was bureaucratic and slow, but eventually a multi-agency investigation was launched that revealed the true extent of the illegal research being conducted at 1247 Industrial Way. The facility was operated by a network of researchers who had been banned from conducting human experimentation at legitimate institutions due to ethical violations and safety concerns. They had established the secret laboratory to continue their work without oversight, using vulnerable populations as test subjects for experimental treatments that had not been approved for human use. The investigation revealed that dozens of people had been subjected to dangerous and unauthorized medical procedures at the facility, often without proper informed consent or understanding of the risks involved. Many of the victims were homeless individuals, undocumented immigrants, or people with mental health issues who had been recruited through false promises of free medical care or financial compensation. The packages I had delivered contained experimental drugs, untested medical devices, and biological materials that were being used in human trials that violated every established ethical and safety standard for medical research. The materials were obtained through fraudulent means from legitimate suppliers who believed they were shipping to authorized research institutions. Dr. Harrison and several other individuals involved in the operation were arrested and charged with multiple felonies including fraud, assault, and endangering public health. The facility was shut down, and the victims were provided with medical monitoring and treatment to address any long-term health consequences of their exposure to experimental treatments. The case highlighted serious weaknesses in the systems designed to track and control dangerous medical and scientific materials, as well as the need for better protection of vulnerable populations from exploitation by unscrupulous researchers. It also demonstrated how legitimate shipping and delivery services could be unknowingly used to facilitate illegal and dangerous activities. My role in uncovering the illegal research operation led to changes in quick-serve logistics procedures for handling shipments of medical and scientific materials, including requirements for additional documentation and verification when delivering to facilities that aren't clearly identified as legitimate institutions. The company also implemented training programs to help drivers recognize warning signs that might indicate illegal or dangerous activities at delivery locations. But the experience left me with a deeper understanding of how sophisticated criminal operations can hide behind facades of legitimate business activity, using normal commercial services to facilitate activities that would shock and horrify the general public if they were conducted openly. The fact that I had unknowingly facilitated illegal human experimentation for months by simply doing my job as a delivery driver was deeply troubling and changed my perspective on the importance of asking questions when something doesn't seem right. The warehouse at 1247 Industrial Way was eventually sold and converted into a legitimate distribution center for auto parts, but I still think about the victims of the illegal research whenever I drive past the building. The knowledge that vulnerable people were subjected to dangerous and unauthorized medical procedures just a few blocks from busy shopping centers and residential neighborhoods serves as a reminder that the most horrific activities can be hidden in plain sight, disguised as ordinary business operations in buildings that look no different from hundreds of others throughout the city. The Hotel Night Manager. The Grand Plaza Hotel had been a landmark in our city's downtown district for over 70 years, serving business travelers, tourists, and special event guests with the elegance and service that had made it a destination in its own right. As the night manager, I was responsible for overseeing all hotel operations between 11 in the evening and 7 in the morning, ensuring that our guests received exceptional service even during the quiet overnight hours. The position required managing a small but dedicated night staff, including front desk clerks, security guards, maintenance personnel, and housekeeping staff who maintained the hotel standards while most guests were sleeping. The work was generally peaceful and routine, with most nights involving little more than checking in late arrivals, responding to occasional guest requests, and ensuring that the building systems operated smoothly. The Grand Plaza was a 12-story building that housed 250 guest rooms, along with conference facilities, restaurants, a fitness center, and various amenities that made it popular for both business and leisure travelers. The building's design reflected the architectural elegance of the 1950s, with marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and rich wood paneling that created an atmosphere of classic luxury and sophistication. What made the Grand Plaza unique among hotels in our city was its unusually complex layout of service areas, storage rooms, and staff facilities that were necessary to support the building's operations without disturbing guests. These behind-the-scenes spaces included laundry facilities, kitchen storage areas, employee break rooms, and maintenance workshops that formed an intricate network throughout the building. During my first few weeks as night manager, I spent considerable time learning the layout of these service areas, as they were essential for responding to maintenance issues, security concerns, and other problems that might arise during overnight hours. Most of the space was functional and well organized, clearly designated for specific purposes and regularly used by our day and evening staff. But there was one section of the hotel's service areas that seemed different from the rest of the building. Located on the 9th floor, this area contained a series of rooms that appeared to be guest suites, but were not included in our reservation system and had never been available for booking. These rooms were fully furnished with high-end furniture, artwork, and amenities that matched the hotel's luxury standards, but they were completely inaccessible to guests and appeared on no floor plans or marketing materials. I initially assumed that these rooms were being held for renovation, VIP guests, or some special purpose that hadn't been explained to me during my orientation. The housekeeping staff had keys to these areas and seemed to clean them regularly, maintaining the same standards as our regular guest rooms, even though they were never occupied by paying customers. But as weeks passed, I began to notice that these mysterious suites showed signs of regular occupancy despite their supposedly vacant status. The beds appeared to have been slept in, the bathrooms showed evidence of recent use, and occasionally I would find personal belongings, clothing, and toiletries arranged as if someone was staying in the rooms on a permanent basis. More puzzling was the discovery that these hidden suites contained personal items and documents that belonged to guests who were staying in regular rooms throughout the hotel. Family photographs, business papers, medication bottles, and clothing items that I had seen guests carrying in the lobby and elevators were somehow duplicated in the secret rooms, arranged exactly as they appeared in the legitimate guest accommodations. The situation became more concerning when I realized that the hidden suites were perfect replicas of specific guest rooms throughout the hotel, complete with identical furniture arrangements, decorations, and even personal belongings that matched what guests had brought with them. It was as if someone was creating detailed duplicates of guest accommodations and maintaining them in secret areas of the building. This discovery led me to investigate the relationship between the hidden suites and our regular guest operations, and I found that the secret rooms were updated to match changes in the real guest rooms with disturbing accuracy. When guests rearranged furniture, unpacked personal belongings, or made any modifications to their accommodations, the corresponding hidden suite was updated to match these changes within hours. The level of surveillance and duplication required for this operation was extensive and sophisticated, involving detailed monitoring of guest activities and access to their personal belongings. Someone was conducting intensive surveillance of hotel guests, creating perfect replicas of their accommodations, and maintaining these secret spaces without the guests' knowledge or awareness. I began paying closer attention to our guest services operations, looking for any indication of how someone could gain such detailed access to guest rooms and personal belongings. The hotel security cameras, keycard systems, and housekeeping procedures all seemed normal and legitimate, but the existence of the hidden suites suggested that guests' privacy was being violated in ways that were completely invisible to normal hotel operations. The breakthrough in my understanding came when I discovered that some members of our housekeeping staff were spending significantly more time in certain guest rooms than would be necessary for normal cleaning and maintenance. These extended room visits coincided with the rooms that had been replicated in the hidden suites, suggesting that the housekeeping staff was involved in the surveillance and duplication operation. Further investigation revealed that several housekeeping employees were photographing guest belongings, measuring furniture arrangements, and collecting samples of personal items that could be used to create accurate replicas in the hidden suites. The operation was coordinated and systematic, involving multiple staff members who had access to guest rooms during normal cleaning schedules when surveillance would be least likely to be detected. The purpose of this elaborate surveillance operation became clear when I discovered that the hidden suites were being used to train individuals in impersonating specific hotel guests. People who had never met our guests were spending hours in the replica rooms, studying personal belongings, practicing mannerisms, and learning intimate details about guests' lives and habits that would allow them to convincingly pose as those individuals. The impersonation training was incredibly sophisticated, involving detailed study of guests' personal documents, business materials, family relationships, and daily routines that would enable the trainees to assume the guests' identities for purposes that were clearly fraudulent and criminal. The hotel was being used as a training facility for identity theft and fraud operations that targeted wealthy business travelers and tourists. The criminal operation was more extensive than I initially realized, involving coordination between corrupt hotel employees and external criminal networks that specialized in high-value identity theft and financial fraud. The guests' personal information, financial documents, and business materials were being copied and analyzed to identify opportunities for fraud that could net hundreds of thousands of dollars from each targeted victim. When I reported my discoveries to hotel management, their response was swift and comprehensive. They immediately terminated the involved employees, contacted law enforcement agencies, and implemented new security procedures designed to prevent future surveillance and fraud operations. The hidden suites were converted to legitimate guest accommodations, and the hotel installed additional security measures to monitor staff activities in guest areas. The criminal investigation revealed that the fraud operation had been active for over 2 years, targeting primarily wealthy business travelers and international tourists who were unlikely to discover identity theft quickly enough to prevent significant financial losses. Dozens of guests had been victimized, losing millions of dollars to fraudsters who used their intimate knowledge of the victims' lives to convince banks, credit card companies, and business associates that they were legitimate. The psychological impact on the victims was severe, as they struggled to understand how criminals had gained such detailed knowledge of their personal lives, business relationships, and financial information. The violation of their privacy during what should have been secure hotel stays was particularly traumatic, destroying their trust in travel accommodations and forcing them to completely restructure their personal and financial security measures. Several members of the criminal network were arrested and prosecuted, but the investigation revealed connections to similar operations at hotels throughout the country, suggesting that the fraud scheme was part of a larger criminal enterprise that targeted luxury accommodations frequented by wealthy travelers. The Grand Plaza Hotel implemented comprehensive reforms, including enhanced background checks for all employees, improved security monitoring of staff activities, and regular audits of all hotel spaces to prevent future criminal operations. The hotel's management also established victim assistance programs to help affected guests recover from identity theft and fraud. But the experience fundamentally changed my understanding of how criminal organizations can infiltrate legitimate businesses to conduct sophisticated fraud operations that are completely invisible to customers and most employees. The idea that guests' most private moments and personal belongings could be studied and replicated for criminal purposes was deeply disturbing and highlighted the vulnerability of travelers who must trust strangers with access to their accommodations. The case also demonstrated how criminal networks have adapted to modern security measures by conducting their operations through corrupt employees at legitimate businesses rather than through external intrusions or cyber attacks. The human element of security, the trustworthiness of employees who have access to sensitive areas and information, remains the most difficult aspect of preventing sophisticated criminal operations. I eventually accepted a position at a smaller boutique hotel where the staff was smaller and security procedures were more transparent. But the experience at the Grand Plaza left me with a permanent awareness of how much trust travelers must place in hotel employees, and how easily that trust can be violated by individuals with criminal intentions. The parking garage attendant. Metro Center Parking Garage was an 8-level structure that served the downtown business district, providing convenient parking for office workers, shoppers, and visitors to the city's core commercial area. As the overnight attendant, my responsibilities included monitoring security cameras, collecting fees from automated payment systems, maintaining the facility's cleanliness and safety, and ensuring that vehicles were secure during the vulnerable overnight hours when the garage was largely empty and unmonitored by regular staff. The facility was designed with efficiency and security in mind, featuring well-lit parking areas, clearly marked levels and sections, and a comprehensive security system that included cameras positioned throughout every level. During business hours, the garage bustled with activity as commuters arrived for work, shoppers visited nearby stores, and visitors conducted business in the surrounding office buildings. But at night, the garage transformed into a vast, echoing cavern of concrete and steel where the sounds of footsteps, car engines, and closing doors carried much farther than during busy daytime hours. Most levels were nearly empty after business hours, with only a few dozen vehicles belonging to restaurant workers, hotel guests, and residents of nearby apartment buildings who paid for monthly parking privileges. My shift began at 11 in the evening and ended at 7 in the morning, covering the hours when the garage was most vulnerable to vandalism, theft, and other security concerns. The work was generally routine and peaceful, involving periodic walks through all levels, monitoring of security feeds, and responding to occasional issues like dead car batteries or minor fender benders that occurred in the automated payment areas. The garage's layout was straightforward, with 8 levels connected by ramps and stairwells that provided access between floors. Each level was designated with large, clearly visible numbers and color-coded signs that helped customers locate their vehicles and find exits. The security office where I spent most of my shift was located on the ground level, providing easy access to all areas of the facility and clear sight lines to the main entrances and exits. What made Metro Center Parking Garage unusual compared to other facilities in the downtown area was the presence of a sub-level parking area that was accessible through a separate entrance and required special access cards for entry. This lower level was marketed as premium secure parking for customers who needed additional protection for expensive vehicles or who required guaranteed parking availability during peak demand periods. The sub-level area was smaller than the regular parking levels, accommodating only about 50 vehicles, and it featured enhanced security measures including additional cameras, restricted access controls, and higher lighting levels. The premium parking service commanded significantly higher fees than regular spaces, but it was consistently full with a waiting list of customers who valued the additional security and convenience. During my first few weeks on the job, I rarely had reason to visit the sub-level area, as it had its own separate security monitoring system and was generally managed independently from the regular parking operations. The customers who used the premium parking service seemed to be primarily business executives, luxury car owners, and individuals who worked unusual hours and needed reliable access to secure parking. But I began to notice patterns in the sub-level parking area that seemed unusual compared to normal parking facility operations. The vehicles in the premium section were rotated and moved much more frequently than would be expected for monthly parking customers, with different cars appearing in the same spaces on a regular basis. The turnover rate suggested that the area was being used for short-term parking rather than the long-term arrangements that were advertised. More puzzling was the discovery that many of the vehicles in the sub-level area had license plates from different states and countries, suggesting that the premium parking service was being used by travelers and visitors rather than local business customers. This didn't align with the marketing materials and customer profiles that had been described to me during my orientation. The situation became more intriguing when I realized that some of the vehicles in the sub-level area appeared to be modified or customized in ways that suggested they were being used for purposes beyond normal transportation. Tinted windows that exceeded legal limits, additional antennas and electronic equipment, reinforced bumpers and body panels, and other modifications that might indicate surveillance, security, or even law enforcement applications. I began paying closer attention to the activity in the sub-level area, monitoring the security feeds more carefully, and noting the patterns of vehicle arrivals and departures. What I observed challenged my understanding of what was supposed to be a simple premium parking service for wealthy customers who wanted additional security for their vehicles. The sub-level area showed consistent activity throughout the night hours, with vehicles arriving and departing at regular intervals that suggested coordinated operations rather than random individual parking needs. Groups of people would arrive in different vehicles, spend time transferring equipment and materials between cars, and then depart in different combinations than they had arrived. The individuals using the sub-level parking service appeared to be engaged in activities that required coordination, planning, and the kind of equipment that suggested professional rather than personal purposes. They moved with purpose and urgency, communicated through earpieces and mobile devices, and handled materials and equipment with the careful precision of people conducting important and potentially dangerous work. Most concerning was the realization that some of the activity in the sub-level area occurred during the same time periods when significant events were taking place in the downtown area. Political rallies, business conferences, cultural festivals, and other high-profile gatherings seemed to coincide with increased activity in the premium parking area, suggesting that the facility was being used as a staging area for operations related to these public events. Riverside Library was housed in a beautiful three-story brick building that reflected the architectural elegance of the 1960s, with large windows, open floor plans, and reading areas that created an atmosphere of scholarly tranquility and intellectual curiosity. The main floor contained the circulation desk, popular fiction and non-fiction collections, periodicals, and computer stations that provided internet access and word processing capabilities. The second floor housed academic and research collections, quiet study areas, and special collections that included rare books, historical documents, and archival materials related to local history and genealogy. The third floor contained meeting rooms, administrative offices, and additional study spaces that were popular with students and researchers who needed extended periods of uninterrupted concentration. What made Riverside Library unique among public libraries in our region was its extensive basement level, which contained not only the standard storage areas and mechanical systems, but also a large collection of materials that were not available to the general public. These restricted materials included rare books, historical documents, and research collections that required special permission and supervision for access. The basement also housed a sophisticated climate control system, security equipment, and preservation facilities that were necessary to maintain the integrity of valuable and fragile materials that comprised some of the library's most important holdings. Access to the basement level was restricted to library staff and approved researchers who had legitimate need to examine materials that were not available through normal circulation procedures. During my first few months on the job, I had minimal reason to visit the basement level, as my responsibilities were focused on the public areas where patrons conducted their research and study activities. The basement was managed by specialized library staff who handled rare book requests, archival research, and the preservation work that was necessary to maintain the collection's long-term integrity. But I began to notice patterns of activity in the basement level that seemed unusual compared to normal library operations. During evening hours, when the building was supposed to be closed to all but emergency staff, I would hear sounds of movement, conversation, and equipment operation coming from the basement areas. The sounds suggested that significant activities were taking place below the main library during hours when no authorized staff were supposed to be working, and no research activities were scheduled to be conducted. The basement level appeared to have its own separate schedule of operations that was independent from the library's official hours and programs. My curiosity about these after-hours basement activities was finally satisfied one evening when I discovered that the basement level could be accessed through a service entrance that was not connected to the library's main security system. This separate entrance allowed people to enter and exit the basement without triggering the alarms or security monitoring that covered the public areas of the building. Using my security access, I investigated the basement level during one of these mysterious evening activity periods, and what I found challenged everything I thought I knew about the library's purpose and operations. Instead of the quiet storage and preservation areas I expected, the basement was configured as a sophisticated research facility with computer workstations, laboratory equipment, and meeting areas that suggested activities far beyond normal library functions. The basement facility was occupied by a group of researchers who appeared to be conducting intensive analysis of historical documents, government records, and private papers that were not part of the library's official collections. The materials they were examining included classified government documents, corporate records, personal correspondence, and other materials that would normally be restricted or unavailable for public research. The research being conducted in the basement appeared to focus on historical events, political activities, and business relationships that had been the subject of controversy or investigation by law enforcement and regulatory agencies. The researchers were using sophisticated analytical tools and computer systems to identify patterns, connections, and evidence that might not be apparent through casual examination of individual documents. Most concerning was the realization that some of the materials being analyzed in the basement research facility appeared to have been obtained through unofficial channels rather than through legitimate archival acquisitions or donations. Government documents that should have remained classified, corporate records that should have been protected by attorney-client privilege, and personal papers that should have been private were being examined and analyzed without apparent authorization from their original owners or custodians. The basement research operation was clearly more sophisticated and extensive than could be supported by a public library's normal budget and resources. The computer equipment, analytical software, and specialized research tools suggested funding and support from organizations with significant resources and specific intelligence-gathering objectives that extended far beyond academic research or historical scholarship. I began documenting the activities I observed in the basement facility, noting the types of materials being analyzed, the research methodologies being employed, and the apparent objectives of the investigations being conducted. The work appeared to focus on identifying corruption, conspiracy, and criminal activity among political figures, business leaders, and other individuals who had been involved in controversial events throughout recent history. The researchers working in the basement facility appeared to have access to information and documents that would normally be available only to law enforcement agencies, intelligence organizations, or other government entities with legal authority to obtain restricted materials. The scope and sophistication of their research suggested that they were conducting investigations that paralleled or supplemented official government inquiries into the same subjects. The discovery that Riverside Public Library was serving as a cover for sophisticated intelligence-gathering operations raised serious questions about the relationship between the facility's official public mission and its unofficial research activities. The basement operation appeared to be using the library's legitimate functions as a shield for activities that might be controversial or illegal if they were conducted openly. My growing concerns about the sub-level operations were validated when I discovered that several of the vehicles being used in the premium parking area had been reported in connection with surveillance activities, security incidents, and law enforcement investigations throughout the region. The license plate numbers and vehicle descriptions matched reports of suspicious activity at various locations where government officials, business leaders, and other high-profile individuals had been present. The realization that Metro Center parking garage was potentially being used as a base of operations for surveillance or security activities that extended throughout the metropolitan area was both fascinating and terrifying. The implication suggested that the facility was connected to activities that could range from legitimate law enforcement operations to corporate espionage to more sinister surveillance and intimidation campaigns. I faced a difficult decision about whether to report my observations to authorities or continue monitoring the situation to gather more information about what was actually taking place in the sub-level area. The activities I had witnessed could have been legitimate security operations conducted by law enforcement or private security firms, or they could have been illegal surveillance and harassment campaigns targeting political figures, business leaders, or private citizens. The decision was made for me when I discovered that my own vehicle and personal information were among the materials being analyzed in the sub-level operations. Documents containing my address, employment history, family information, and daily routines were found among surveillance files that were being maintained in several of the modified vehicles. The realization that I was being monitored and investigated by the same people who were using my workplace as their base of operations was both frightening and infuriating. It suggested that my position as overnight attendant had made me a person of interest, either as a potential witness to their activities or as someone who needed to be controlled to ensure the security of their operations. I immediately contacted law enforcement agencies and reported my observations about the suspicious activities in the sub-level parking area. The investigation that followed revealed that the premium parking service was being used as cover for a sophisticated surveillance operation that targeted political figures, business leaders, and activists throughout the metropolitan area. The operation involved multiple government agencies, private security firms, and corporate interests that were coordinating surveillance and intelligence-gathering activities that extended far beyond what would be legally authorized for law enforcement purposes. The parking garage provided an ideal location for staging surveillance operations, storing specialized equipment, and coordinating activities without attracting the attention that would be generated by more obvious facilities. The investigation uncovered evidence of illegal surveillance, harassment, and intimidation campaigns that had been conducted against hundreds of individuals, including elected officials, business executives, journalists, activists, and private citizens who had been deemed persons of interest by the various organizations involved in the operation. Many of the surveillance targets were completely unaware that they had been monitored, photographed, and investigated by the networks operating out of Metro Center Parking Garage. The violation of their privacy and civil liberties had occurred over a period of several years, affecting their personal relationships, business activities, and political participation in ways they would never fully understand. The legal consequences of the investigation were extensive, resulting in criminal charges against multiple individuals, civil lawsuits against the organizations involved, and regulatory reforms designed to prevent similar surveillance operations from being conducted without proper oversight and legal authorization. Metro Center Parking Garage was sold to a new management company that implemented comprehensive security measures designed to prevent the facility from being used for unauthorized activities. The sub-level premium parking area was eliminated, and all parking operations were consolidated into the regular facility with enhanced transparency and monitoring. But the experience left me with a deeper understanding of how sophisticated surveillance operations can hide behind legitimate business facades, using ordinary commercial facilities to conduct activities that would be impossible to conceal if they were carried out in obvious government or security installations. The case also highlighted how individuals in routine service jobs can inadvertently become witnesses to criminal activities and targets for surveillance, simply because their work provides access to locations where illegal operations are being conducted. The knowledge that my employment had placed me at the center of a major surveillance scandal was both disturbing and educational about the hidden networks that operate in plain sight throughout our society. I eventually found employment at a smaller, family-owned parking facility where the operations were simple and transparent. But the experience at Metro Center changed my perspective on the potential for criminal and surveillance activities to be hidden within ordinary business operations that most people would never suspect of harboring such sophisticated and potentially dangerous activities. The library night clerk. Riverside Public Library was a cornerstone of our community for over 50 years, serving thousands of patrons with an extensive collection of books, periodicals, multimedia resources, and computer access that supported education, research, and personal enrichment for people of all ages. As the night security clerk, I was responsible for maintaining the facility during evening hours when the library remained open late to serve students, working professionals, and community members who needed access outside normal business hours. The position required monitoring patron activities, ensuring building security, maintaining order in study areas, and providing basic assistance with locating materials and using library resources. The work was generally quiet and rewarding, offering opportunities to help people with research projects, homework assignments, and personal interests that brought them to the library during peaceful evening hours. My concerns about the basement research facility were validated when I discovered that some of the investigators working there had backgrounds in intelligence agencies, law enforcement, and corporate security, rather than academic research or library science. These individuals were not typical library staff or researchers, but professionals with specialized training in investigation, surveillance, and intelligence analysis. The realization that professional investigators were using the library as a base for operations that extended throughout the community and potentially throughout the country was both fascinating and deeply troubling. The implications suggested that public institutions like libraries could be infiltrated and used for purposes that were completely different from their official missions and public mandates. I eventually reported my discoveries to library administration and local government officials, but the response was complex and evasive. Some officials claimed complete ignorance of the basement research operations, while others suggested that the activities were related to legitimate historical research and government transparency initiatives that were being conducted with appropriate authorization and oversight. The investigation that followed revealed that the basement research facility was indeed connected to various government agencies and oversight organizations that were conducting investigations into historical corruption, conspiracy, and criminal activity. However, the methods being used to obtain and analyze restricted materials raised questions about legal authority and proper procedures for handling sensitive documents. Some of the research being conducted in the basement was eventually determined to be legitimate and properly authorized, while other activities were found to violate privacy laws, classification procedures, and ethical guidelines for handling restricted materials. The mixed nature of the operations made it difficult to determine which activities should be allowed to continue and which needed to be terminated or reformed. Riverside Public Library implemented new policies and procedures designed to ensure that all research activities conducted on the premises complied with legal requirements and ethical standards for handling sensitive materials. The basement facility was converted to more traditional library functions, including expanded storage for the regular collection and additional study areas for graduate students and academic researchers. But the experience left me with a deeper understanding of how public institutions can be used for purposes that extend far beyond their official missions, and how difficult it can be for ordinary employees to distinguish between legitimate activities and operations that may violate legal or ethical boundaries. The case also highlighted the complex relationships between public institutions, government agencies, and private research organizations that can result in activities that are simultaneously legal and questionable, authorized and inappropriate, beneficial to public interests and harmful to individual privacy and civil liberties. I eventually accepted a position at a smaller community library where the operations were more transparent and traditional. But the experience at Riverside changed my perspective on the potential for public institutions to harbor hidden activities that serve interests and objectives that may be completely different from what the public believes those institutions are supposed to accomplish. The University Maintenance Worker. State University was a sprawling campus that served over 30,000 students with academic programs, research facilities, and residential areas that formed a small city within the larger metropolitan community. As a maintenance worker for the university's facilities department, I was responsible for repairs, cleaning, and upkeep of buildings throughout the campus, ensuring that classrooms, dormitories, and administrative facilities remained functional and safe for the academic community. The job provided access to virtually every building on campus, from modern research laboratories and technology centers to historic academic halls and residential buildings that had served students for over a century. Each facility had its own character and maintenance requirements, ranging from routine cleaning and minor repairs to complex mechanical and electrical systems that supported sophisticated research and educational activities. My work schedule varied depending on maintenance priorities and emergency repair needs, but I often found myself working during evening and weekend hours when buildings were less crowded and major repairs could be completed without disrupting academic activities. These quiet periods provided opportunities to work efficiently and thoroughly, while also observing aspects of campus life that were hidden from normal public view. State University's campus was designed around a central quadrangle surrounded by academic buildings, with residential areas, research facilities, and athletic complexes extending outward in carefully planned zones. The underground infrastructure was equally complex, with utility tunnels, storage areas, and service corridors that connected buildings and provided access for maintenance, security, and emergency services. What made State University unique among educational institutions in our region was the extensive network of underground facilities that had been built over decades of campus expansion and renovation. These subterranean areas included not only standard utility spaces and storage rooms, but also laboratories, meeting areas, and specialized facilities that were not accessible to students or most faculty members. During my first year working for the facilities department, I had accessed many of these underground areas for routine maintenance tasks, but there were sections that remained locked and off-limits even to maintenance staff. These restricted areas were managed by university administration and specialized personnel who handled functions that were apparently separate from normal academic and research activities. My curiosity about the restricted underground areas was finally satisfied when I was assigned to repair a water leak that had developed in a utility corridor adjacent to one of the off-limit sections. The repair work required accessing areas that were normally sealed, and I discovered that the restricted sections contained facilities that were far more sophisticated and secretive than I had expected. Instead of additional storage or utility space, the restricted underground areas housed what appeared to be research laboratories and meeting facilities that were equipped with technology and security measures that exceeded anything I had seen in the university's regular academic and research buildings. The spaces were pristine, well-maintained, and clearly in active use despite being hidden from normal campus operations. The underground laboratories contained scientific equipment that appeared to be related to medical research, chemical analysis, and biological studies that required sophisticated containment and safety measures. Clean rooms, isolation chambers, and specialized disposal systems suggested that research was being conducted on materials or subjects that posed potential health or environmental risks. Most disturbing was the discovery of what appeared to be medical examination and treatment areas that resembled hospital facilities more than academic research laboratories. Patient beds, monitoring equipment, and medical supplies suggested that human subjects were being examined, treated, or experimented upon in these hidden underground facilities. The realization that State University was harboring secret medical research facilities that were conducting human experimentation without public knowledge or oversight was deeply troubling. The sophisticated nature of the equipment and facilities suggested that significant resources were being invested in research activities that were being deliberately concealed from the academic community and the general public. I began documenting the hidden facilities and the activities I observed during my maintenance work in the underground areas. The research being conducted appeared to involve experimental medical treatments, psychological studies, and pharmaceutical testing that would normally require extensive ethical review and regulatory oversight if they were conducted through official university channels. The subjects of the research appeared to include university students, faculty members, and community volunteers who may not have been fully informed about the nature or risks of the procedures they were participating in. The consent forms and research protocols I observed suggested that participants were being misled about the experimental nature of the treatments they were receiving. The underground research facilities were connected to various academic departments throughout the university, but the research being conducted was far more advanced and controversial than the publicly disclosed research activities of those departments. Faculty members who were involved in the secret research appeared to be conducting two separate research programs: official studies that were published and discussed openly, and classified studies that were conducted in the hidden underground facilities. The funding for the secret research appeared to come from government agencies, pharmaceutical companies, and private organizations that had interests in developing new medical treatments, psychological manipulation techniques, and biological weapons that could not be researched through normal academic channels due to ethical and legal restrictions. My investigation of the underground facilities eventually led to the discovery that State University was serving as a cover for human experimentation programs that had been banned or restricted at other institutions due to ethical violations and safety concerns. The university's legitimate academic reputation provided protection for research activities that would have been impossible to conduct at facilities that were known to be involved in controversial or dangerous experimentation. The subjects of the secret research included vulnerable populations such as students with financial difficulties, individuals with mental health issues, and community members who were recruited through false promises of free medical care or compensation for participation in supposedly routine medical studies. When I reported my discoveries to university administration, the response was swift and comprehensive, but not in the way I had expected. Instead of investigating the illegal research activities, the administration focused on my unauthorized access to restricted areas and my violation of confidentiality agreements that I had signed when I was hired by the facilities department. I was terminated from my position within days of reporting the human experimentation, and I was threatened with legal action if I discussed my discoveries with law enforcement agencies, media organizations, or anyone outside the university. The administration claimed that the activities I had observed were legitimate research activities that were properly authorized and conducted with appropriate ethical oversight. However, my documentation of the illegal research eventually reached federal agencies that were responsible for investigating human rights violations and unethical medical research. The investigation that followed revealed that State University had indeed been conducting unauthorized human experimentation for several years, involving hundreds of subjects who had been misled about the nature and risks of the procedures they participated in. The research had resulted in serious injuries, long-term health problems, and psychological trauma for many participants who had trusted the university to conduct ethical and safe research. The violation of their rights and dignity was extensive and systematic, affecting their academic performance, career prospects, and personal relationships in ways that would never be fully remedied. Multiple faculty members, administrators, and research staff were arrested and charged with criminal violations of human rights laws, medical ethics regulations, and research oversight requirements. The university faced extensive civil lawsuits from victims and regulatory sanctions that affected its accreditation, funding, and reputation throughout the academic community. The underground research facilities were closed and converted to legitimate academic and storage purposes, but the investigation revealed that similar operations were being conducted at other universities throughout the country, suggesting that the human experimentation program was part of a larger network of illegal research activities that exploited the academic community's trust and authority. The case highlighted serious weaknesses in the systems designed to oversee and regulate research activities at academic institutions, as well as the vulnerability of students and community members who participate in research studies without fully understanding the potential risks and consequences of their participation. My role in exposing the illegal research activities led to reforms in university research oversight procedures and whistleblower protection policies, but it also effectively ended my career in facilities maintenance, as other institutions were reluctant to hire someone who had exposed criminal activities at a previous employer. The experience left me with a deeper understanding of how academic institutions can abuse their authority and community trust to conduct activities that would be recognized as criminal if they were performed by organizations without the protection of academic freedom and intellectual respectability. The knowledge that students and community members who trusted State University to provide education and legitimate research opportunities were instead subjected to dangerous and unauthorized medical experimentation was profoundly disturbing and changed my perspective on the potential for even respected institutions to harbor the most horrific violations of human rights and dignity. But the case also demonstrated that ordinary employees who maintain and support these institutions can play a crucial role in exposing criminal activities and protecting vulnerable members of the community. even when doing so comes at significant personal and professional cost. The responsibility to speak out against illegal and unethical activities is sometimes more important than job security or career advancement, particularly when the victims are unable to protect themselves or even recognize that they are being victimized.